What exactly determines whether a job is hard to play? It is indeed a lot of things, and some things affect some players more than others, and sometimes what content you do can also matter in regards to which job is the hardest. Now, to help me answer the question of which melee is the hardest, I sent out a poll to ask all of you. A lot of you did vote, and honestly, this time I was not that surprised by the order, but more by the sheer percentage difference. Now, you may have already peeked at the video length or even the chapters and noticed that multiple jobs are up for debate, and indeed we will be talking about what could make each job feel difficult, ranging between many different skill levels, all the way from casual to hardcore optimization, trying to squeeze every single point of damage possible. We will be talking about the jobs in order from easiest to hardest as well. Also, some of you might be saying, what's the point? Dawntrail is coming real soon anyway. And the point is exactly to see if these jobs become easier with Dawntrail. And with that, let's get started. For each job, we'll be talking about the general difficulties and challenges of the job, the difficulty in the leveling experience, the difficulty in a more casual setting where at most you might typically try to optimize around your own cooldowns, and the difficulty in a coordinated raid group setting where we try to see how much you can optimize and how hard that would be when coordinating with the entire team. For the easiest job, with very few votes, we have Reaper. The things that make Reaper stand out as difficult is the fact that the job starts at level 70, which introduces a bunch of things all at once, and then also a few confusing actions alongside a trap. For the confusing actions, we first have Gibbet and Gallows that spend a surprising amount of text to explain that if you alternate them, they get stronger. Add to this Unveiled Gibbet and Gallows, boosting Bloodstalk's damage once either Gallows or Gibbet has been used recently. But again, confusing a new Reaper into thinking there might be some sort of thing they need to do about it, like maybe they also have positionals? They don't. This same confusion also applies to Cross and Void Reaping that, again, spend a lot of text to explain that you do more damage if you alternate them. But unlike Gibbet and Gallows, which these buttons replace, these reaping actions don't have positionals. Finally, the trap is of course that Hell's Ingress and Egress makes your next harp instant, which causes some new Reapers to think this is supposed to be part of the rotation. When in reality, this instant cast is more like a mild compensation, so you lose slightly less damage from having to move. There's also the need to maintain Death's Design on your targets, however, once all this confusion is resolved by reading the tooltips enough, Reaper at large isn't too complex or overwhelming. Leveling Reaper introduces Enshroud alongside eventually a finisher for it, a raid buff that eventually enables you to enter Shroud faster, Gluttony to be used on cooldown if possible, and Soul Sow to use essentially once per combat that can mislead some players, especially if they don't realize exactly how long the cast is when in combat. Overall, the leveling experience of Reaper is somewhat similar in some ways to Machinist, in that the job is introduced with some things it lacks, and these things are filled in. Notably, adding a second charge to Soul Slice, and adding a way to more quickly access Enshroud with Plentiful Harvest. Reaper also having an extremely strong and easily accessible defensive cooldown in Arcane Crest also helps immensely with making the job easier to use. The fact that Reaper generates resources from mob kills also makes it particularly effective in dungeons, which the leveling experience tends to revolve around primarily. The flexibility of being able to use Enshroud almost whenever you want to, and being able to stockpile 2 of them again lends itself really well to a nice leveling experience. Finally, the fact that the job has a rather limited selection of OGCD options causes the job to feel very slow, which makes it easier to think about what to do next. Given that most of the things the job has to do can be planned way in advance helps further with this. You can maintain Death's Design on a high duration, you have 30 seconds to plan when you want to use your Soul Slice charge, and Enshroud is also very open on when you choose to use it, leading to a very easy job overall. Once we get to optimizing Reaper in a casual setting, focused mainly on yourself, one of the things that can make the job more complex is trying to make the most of your arcane circle by using tricks like the double Enshroud. This trick alone introduces potential issues with actually getting away with using Gluttony on cooldown. However, it is worth pointing out that if your only damage boost is Arcane Circle, the 3% bonus damage makes this kind of optimization not hugely impactful. Using all of your resources effectively is often almost as good as this extra step of double Enshroud. If, hypothetically, you couldn't manage to do both. Going up to raid coordinated optimization, Reaper now has a rather strict gearing situation where you want a very small amount of skill speed, and once that is attained, you have the choice between two separate openers in Early Enshroud and Early Gluttony, with Early Enshroud typically getting ahead, but normally being a problem to use if you have more skill speed than this minimal amount. The double Enshroud is equally significant to use, and because of how you need to start on the Enshroud before raid buffs come out, you have a similar experience to how red mages can do their double melee combo, with the core difference being that double Enshroud sort of becomes a core part of your burst. Meaning that double Enshroud jumps from being an option if you can line it up in casual situations to being something that can be fundamental to maximizing your damage. Add in a tincture and all the raid buffs, the ability to fit 2 communios in this burst window will become a lot more significant. However, despite this, Reaper is still viewed as rather easy by most players, simply because most of the potential damage of the job can be attained with a priority rotation, combined with the somewhat simple nature of the filler rotation, which is just a 1-2-3. For the second easiest of the melees, with also a reasonably low amount of votes, we have Samurai. Not only is Samurai the poster child of the selfish DPS, it does not even have a personal temporary damage buff, which means that if you're not planning around any raid buffs whatsoever, then the exact timing of anything actually is irrelevant as long as you use your cooldowns. With that said, Samurai is also one of the jobs that gains some of its complexity from the simple fact that it starts at level 50. Yet, similar to Reaper, its basic toolkit at level 50 boils down to all of its filler combos, its finishing move Iaijutsu, and a button to more quickly access these in Make Your Shisui. Meaning that initially the job is simply about maintaining 2 buffs, which is easy, and maintaining a dot on a minute duration. When it comes to leveling Samurai, it introduces 2 secondary gauges that, for the most part, both just boils down to your way to access OGCD options. You also get a way to double down on your Iaijutsus at times, which of course introduces the possibility of making the mistake of using Kaishi Higanbana, right? And Ikishoten eventually introduces a way to access your strongest attack, Oginamikiri. However, given that you don't have any temporary damage buffs of your own, for the most part, the job is all about using everything you have efficiently. And the fact that both Make Your Shisui and Tsubamegaishi eventually get a second charge greatly reduces the amount of effort it takes to actually make all this line up perfectly. Advancing to casual, personal optimization at max level, not much changes for Samurai. You don't have any damage buffs you need to plan around really, so everything can still be used whenever. However, some casual Samurai players will advance onto making burst sequences in their rotation, just in case there are any raid buffs to benefit from. However, the simple fact that this is kinda optional in a casual setting further underlines why Samurai is often viewed as extremely easy. Moving up to raid coordinated optimization, we immediately introduce tinctures, which at the very least introduces a burst window for yourself, giving the Samurai immediate reason to make the most of the first 30 seconds of a fight, and later, around the 6-minute mark typically, there as well. With coordinated raid buffs, however, there is reason for a Samurai to make the most of even their odd minute bursts in case an astrologian gives them a card, for example. This introduces the looping rotation, which then gives Hagakure a proper reason to be used in your rotation aside from resetting because you want to. And this looping rotation suddenly adds a lot more depth to the job's optimization, as you need to keep track of how many extra filler GCDs you need to include to make sure your burst comes out on time, which means you need to keep track of exactly what your skill speed actually is, and if a boss causes any downtime whatsoever, you would need to know how many GCDs that costs you so you can adjust around that. Go one step further in optimization and you might just be able to plan out your rotation without needing to do these extra Hagakure fillers if you know the particular boss fight well enough. Which, in a weird way, removes this complexity of the looping rotation again. This, similar to Machinist in a way, causes Samurai to be a job where it can be considered insanely easy for both casual players and hardcore players, but a little more difficult for those in between. For the middle of the pack, we have Dragoon with 1/10 of the votes. The core aspects that causes difficulty for Dragoon are some of the more counterintuitive parts of the job, like Gaishgagul being used first before jump, and the rather OGZD spammy nature of its burst. For a lot of players, the simple fact that it has so many different cooldowns can also just make the job way too overwhelming, and is often best overcome by focusing on a select few. As Dragoon starts all the way down at level 1, the leveling experience essentially gradually introduces a burst with Lance Charge and then adds more cooldowns to it with the various jumps, more damage buffs, and eventually the Life of the Dragon burst. The filler rotation itself also being almost completely detached from the burst in that the cooldowns are used when they are there, and the GSD rotation is simply used with whatever comes up as it comes up, which can also make the job confusing, as it can feel like playing two different rotations simultaneously, with Life Surge effectively being the only bridge between the two. The filler rotation also has this interesting evolution where you start by doing a lot of full thrust combos per chaos thrust combo, and it gradually morphs into one of each and just alternating. As a result of Dragoon having this many OGZDs to keep track of, it can often feel like the job gets harder the less structured you are about using them, as if the cooldowns stop lining up together, it can be too overwhelming to keep track of all of them. This can cause Dragoon to be a job that feels very easy to manage for the first many levels, and then suddenly it gets exponentially more difficult as more and more and more gets added. Moving to casual, personal optimization, Dragoon deals with many of the same issues as it does during leveling, where a proper opener is necessary to keep track of everything and placing everything in an order where the different cooldowns don't step on each other's toes. Yet, again, the fact that Gaishgagul goes first can be extremely counterintuitive, since for most other jobs, you want your burst as soon as possible, and Dragoon simply does not get Life of the Dragon in the opener, and using jump first instead leads to this burst landing outside of all of your damage cooldowns. This causes this weird interaction where you'd rather wait a full minute for this burst, which can be very weird when compared to other jobs where either the burst is complete in the opener or you simply cannot do it fully until 1 or 2 minutes in. Stepping up to raid coordinated optimization, not that much changes for Dragoon beyond all the cooldown management being more mandatory, and where in a casual setting, if something drifts completely out, you can at least fix it by being a bit slow on the second time around. In a raid coordinated situation, you sort of need all of the cooldowns to come out on time, and something drifting out of the sequence can be devastating. Mainly because holding it for the next round is usually a bigger loss than using it now, which means that if something no longer lines up correctly, you now have one more timer to keep track of. However, as the Dragoon comes with raid buffs of its own, tinctures and other raid buffs do not change things much. Moving on to the second hardest, with nearly 1/3 of the votes, we have Ninja. The general overview of the difficulty of Ninja boils down to memorizing mudras and burst combos. Where many jobs have burst combos and a filler rotation that builds to said burst naturally, Ninja's rotation is the ultimate example of a rotation where it feels like basically nothing is happening outside of the burst. This leads to a job that can be viewed as outright impossible or trivial depending on how well you understand these kinds of concepts. Leveling Ninja introduces many oddities right out the gate. You get Hide to use with Trick Attack early, but you will never be allowed to use Trick Attack on a boss due to how entering combat with a boss works. Mug also is offered as the lowest level raid damage bonus in the game, with most other jobs getting theirs at level 50. Once ninjutsus are unlocked, the job also has this confusing upgrade where Hide quietly gains the ability to reset your ninjutsus, which is also stated in the ninjutsu tooltip itself. By level 50, the job has a whole selection of ninjutsus to choose between, yet some of them are never the right choice, and some of them are easily misunderstood. Hyoton is never something you'd really want to cast outside of Kasatsu at higher levels, and Doton does not explain itself well, and most jobs with dots want to maintain them all the time. However, Doton does less damage than Raiton if there's only one target. This leads to a situation where, on the one hand, it feels right to use the 3 Mudra Jutsus more since they would be better, right? Yet, each of the 3 Mudra Jutsus are actually situational options that are right given the correct circumstances, where the 2 Mudra Jutsus are the ones that just do good damage. With Suiton and Huton in the toolkit, using ninjutsus becomes something that can easily get messed up. Huton needs to be maintained, Suiton needs to go out once a minute for trick attack, and that leaves 1 extra Raiton for the window where trick attack is running. Meaning that already by level 50, the job has a rather strict burst rotation, combined with needing to memorize the sequences to access the different ninjutsus. And all this is further built on with more OGCDs like Dream Within a Dream, and GCDs like Armor Crush and Horaijin as ways to maintain Huton without spending jutsus. As well as Tenshijin by level 70, requiring you to not just remember the sequences for each jutsu, but how they lead into each other, so you can correctly get Raiton and then Suiton, or Katon and then Doton. All of this is made even more confusing from a leveling perspective, since dungeons are a huge part of leveling a job, and cooldowns have a tendency to drift apart in dungeons while running between fights. Ninja being so single-minded about its burst can make it feel even harder as a result. From a casual, personal optimization perspective, a single target boss fight is almost a step down in difficulty for Ninja, since you can just focus on aligning your burst and using things on cooldown, like Bunshin. But as a result of the job being so focused on the burst, that even during leveling, it is hard to play the job without that as the primary focus, not that much changes. Once it comes to raid coordinated optimization, we add in a tincture and other raid buffs on top of Trick and Mug, which doesn't really change that much for Ninja. The big worry is if something causes a delay in the rotation, which could drift something. But as the rotation of Ninja is, as mentioned, so burst-centric, and the other main difficulty is memorizing mudras, what often happens is that casual players will find Ninja incredibly overwhelming and difficult, and even the in-betweeners might feel this way too. Yet, at a certain skill level, something like burst optimization is something that is entirely obvious, and the difficult part is simply memorizing the sequence Ninja does, which takes a few goes probably. This can often cause players that main Ninja to not only believe the job is not hard, but outright extremely simple. And finally, for the hardest melee, with over half of the votes, Monk. With both the fastest GCD of all jobs, a filler rotation that directly interacts with the burst similar to Samurai, and multiple damage buffs like Dragoon and Ninja, this job combines some of the things that make all the other jobs difficult, while adding something on top. Leveling a monk gradually adds things to keep track of, while making the rotation go faster and faster, which of course makes perfect sense, yet is what contributes the most to the difficulty of the job. Ultimately, the filler rotation simply boils down to alternate Dragon Kick and Boot Shine, alternate Twin Snakes and True Strike, demolish once, snap punch twice. Which doesn't seem that hard, yet because the reasons you alternate them are placed in 3 different buffs, it can be difficult to keep track of this, and because this rotation leads to a situation where you have to either remember a full 18-step loop, or plan your rotation 1 to 3 steps at a time, this can get overwhelming for a lot of players. At level 50, Perfect Balance is introduced, yet because it lacks Masterful Blitz, it feels like it breaks the rotation more than adds to it. And once Masterful Blitz come in, and more damage buffs come in, what felt like a super fast, endless filler rotation feels like it is regularly interrupted by a freestyle burst, where you just kind of have to know what to do with it. Despite where you are in your rotation when this burst comes up, having a direct impact on what you want to do with it. Options like an Atman and Six-Sided Star that are super situational also adds to the confusion of this job. Overall, this combines for a job that can be very overwhelming in many different ways. When it comes to personal optimization at a casual level, Monk is actually not that bad. When only optimizing for yourself, you can simply choose to delay your burst until it lines up with the way you like best in your filler sequence, for a reasonably small loss. However, this doesn't change the fact that Monk having cooldowns like Riddle of Fire means making the most of perfect balance in that window is rather important. One particular aspect of Monk that is often overlooked in the difficulty of the job is that as long as Masterful Blitzes are performed correctly, making mistakes in the job is not actually that painful for your damage. Where Ninja using Raiden at the wrong time can cause their trick attack to come out wrong, or a Dragoon leading with jump could ruin their rotation for ages, Monks don't lose that much by using the wrong filler GSD at a given time. This culminates in the rather well-known Dragon Kick rotation, where you simply spam Dragon Kick until Twin Snakes or Demolish needs to be reapplied, and just use Boot Shine at the end there if the buff is up, or otherwise just mash Dragon Kick all day, which makes the filler rotation much simpler. While that is of course a slightly memey rotation that isn't optimal, it does highlight a key fact that Monk's filler rotation is very, very forgiving despite what it feels like. This causes the job to feel much harder and much more punishing than perhaps it really is. Advance onward to raid coordinated optimization, and Monk splits into its two known rotation styles, looping and optimal drift, with one relying on forcibly causing their filler rotation to loop in a certain way with their bursts, and the other requiring you to know how to properly perform your burst regardless of where you are in your rotation when the burst comes up. Both of these rotations can be heavily affected by downtime, due to the speed of the job making it difficult for a lot of players to figure it out on the fly. To really emphasize the complexity of optimal drift, you could say that you might need to know a different burst sequence for each of your 6 single-target filler GSDs, although with the correct amount of skill speed, you often will be able to perform the same burst 2 minutes in, 4 minutes in, 6 minutes in, and so on, despite how free-flowing it can feel or sound. Monk also has at least 4 different common openers, which they can switch between based on both the fight at hand and when they expect the boss to die. Finally, Monk has this weird interaction where, if you play the game on a specific frame rate, you might need to play with a different skill speed. This alone can cause a lot of players to perceive the job as being far more complicated than it is as well. However, it is no secret that while the design of the job means there may not be that far from a great performance to a perfect performance in terms of damage output, the difficulty of making that leap makes the job the hardest among the melee by a huge margin. So before we round up, there are a few factors that I do recognize also play into a ranking of difficulty of jobs. Naturally, players that main a given job typically find that job a lot easier to play, meaning, for example, that people that never played Reaper might be inclined to say Reaper is harder. Similarly, Ninja mains would be less likely to say that Ninja was hardest. Another factor is that in a poll like this, some people might just vote on whatever they believe is hardest, and both Monk and Ninja are known to be quite difficult, which can further inflate their numbers. Such a poll also gathers results from all skill levels, from new players to veterans, from hyper-casuals to hardcore Savage Raiders. Anyone could have voted. And finally, there's of course also players that vote randomly just for the sake of it, or vote based on something other than actual difficulty, which can sometimes skew the results a bit. However, I do feel that the jobs did get ranked in a way that makes sense with the things we know would make a job difficult. Now, to summarize. Reaper's difficulty is mainly about picking it up initially and making the most of the cooldowns it has, making sure Gluttony isn't forgotten between the enshrouds, and also learning how to use tricks like double enshroud. Samurai difficulty comes primarily from aligning with the buffs of everyone else, which makes it have a surprising jump in difficulty from a casual perspective to the stage where you try to coordinate with other raid buffs. Dragoon's difficulty stems heavily from an overwhelming amount of OGSDs, its own 3 damage buffs needing to align, and the confusion of the counterintuitive nature of using Gaishkagul first, for example. Ninja's difficulty comes from learning and memorizing the different ninjutsu sequences, and then the rest of the difficulty comes from primarily properly stringing together bursts, where for some jobs it is a way to increase their damage. For ninjas, it can feel like the only way to actually make the rotation make sense at all. And finally for Monk, the difficulty comes from the pace of the job combined with also needing to string together bursts depending on where you are in your rotation, which itself has a lot of alternating and moving parts. I admit that I probably may have forgotten details or maybe have even skipped quietly over something important in my analysis in this video, so if you have anything to add about the difficulty or ease of any of the jobs, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before 5.1 of Shadowbringers, ninjas ninjutsus were entirely off the global cooldown, meaning they were effectively entirely OGCDs. However, good luck with that. To use Raiton perfectly on time, you needed to triple weave it. To use Suiton perfectly on time, you needed to quadruple weave it. This meant that, for example, at certain latencies, not even that high, Huma Shuriken was better than Raiton, due to the time saved by weaving one less time.